Good day, friends. I'm Kerry Dillinger. This is Bible Class Topics, and it's another lesson in our study, Evidence for Our Faith. This is profiling the potential believer. This is lesson 2 of 2. In the previous lesson, we talked about profiling the potential unbeliever. We'll have some more to say about them as well in this lesson. Let's get our Bibles out and let's study together. I want to begin our study today with a quote from Dan King in an article that he wrote, which he entitled Profile of an Unbeliever. Brother King said this: "It is important for us to be able to distinguish between those who may be ideal subjects for evangelism rather than one who might prove to be an interesting participant in an intellectual conversation about philosophy and religion. The latter is not our interest, nor should it be. And so, in terms of the kinds of people we may encounter in life, the following are a few of the ones whom we may fit easily into an appropriate category in order to reach them for the Lord, as illustrated by some characters from the New Testament." And so we want to talk about the open-minded potential believer, the not just yet candidate, and also the unchurched, and then the hardened enemy of the faith. So that's where we're going today. I hope that this interests you and you'll stick around for the next few minutes and study along with me. What are the characteristics of this person that we're calling the open-minded potential believer? Well, first of all, they're willing to listen to the truth. In Acts 2:41, Peter had just preached the first gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. These people showed up not having ever heard the truth, and by the time Peter finished his sermon, they were converted. They were willing to listen. They heard the truth, they understood that it was the truth, and they obeyed the truth. The open-minded potential believer is willing to search the Scriptures and ask Bible questions like the Bereans of Acts 17:11. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. These people were willing to open up their Scriptures, unroll the scrolls, and see if the things that Paul was teaching them was true, and indeed many of them, not all of them, many of them obeyed the gospel. The open-minded potential believer must be willing to believe and be baptized like the Corinthians, specifically Crispus. Crispus was a Jew, Acts 18:8. He was the ruler of the synagogue in Corinth, and he believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. You know, we were talking about this in a Zoom Bible study not too long ago, just a few days ago, and one of the participants in there said one characteristic of an open-minded potential believer is someone that you have a Bible study with and then they show up twice. How many times have we begun Bible studies and there's a study, they come to your house or you go to their house or you meet at the public library or down at the coffee shop and there's a study, but then excuses begin and you realize that that person is not amenable to the Bible. It's our responsibility to share the good news with the willing listener. Listen to Ecclesiastes 11, verse 6. The preacher said, "In the morning sow your seed, And at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. We'll have more to say about this attitude when we talk about our responsibilities of sowing the seed of the kingdom. Those who close their minds and their Bibles will never be a good prospect for our time and effort, but those willing to talk openly and investigate Bible truths are the best prospects of all. Should we forget about the not just yet candidate or the unchurched? Well, a bad example of a not just yet candidate is Felix. He was in charge and he held Paul in jail and wouldn't let him out. But he came and talked to Paul day by day. Let's get our Bibles and open to Acts 24, verse 24. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control, and then the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." Felix said, "Not just yet." At the same time, Felix hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but Felix, desiring to do the Jews a favor, left Paul in prison. Well, here's somebody who said, "Not just yet." Maybe there will be another opportunity. And of course, we can see from this passage, even though it's a short passage, we can see the opportunities went on and on and on and on. And when the time for him to leave came, he had done nothing about obeying the gospel of Christ. Some may not initially be interested because they have not even considered the gospel and therefore are not motivated to change. You know, our friendships and our Christian examples might cause them to consider Jesus as time passes. And that shows us an example of someone who is the unchurched. They'd never been exposed to the gospel. They didn't really know what it was all about. But something happened with them that showed them that this was a way or the way that they needed to follow in their spiritual lives. Let's read about the Philippian jailer. It's a long reading. I'm going to get out my Bible, my ESV, and turn it to Acts 16, and we'll read verse 25 all the way down through 40. Paul and Silas are thrown in jail in Philippi. It's about midnight, and they're praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them that same hour of the night and washed their wounds. And he was baptized at once, he and all of his family. Then he brought them up into the house and set food before them. And he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and they do not will not throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. So they came and they apologized to them. They took them out and asked them to please leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them, and they departed. Here's an example then of an unchurched family, the family of the Philippian jailer. They had not heard the gospel. They had not even heard there was a good news concerning Christ. And yet, they were able to be reached because of things that occurred there in that prison. Of course, today we cannot depend on these kind of miracles to open the eyes of people towards the gospel. We have to depend on their own good, honest heart. But our point is, the not just yet person deserves our attention. The unchurched person deserves our attention. Think about this. Think about our friendships, our neighbors, our friends, our folks that we work with. You know, a crisis may arise that sends them to you for help and comfort. If you're their enemy, of course they won't consider you to be a fit counselor. We have to make friends. We have to make neighbors. We have to be the kind of coworker that is dependable and helpful. The more people trust us, the more possible candidates for conversion we will cultivate. What about these hardened enemies of the faith? Well, there's examples. Paul warned Timothy about Alexander the coppersmith. If we read in 2 Timothy 4, verses 14 and 15, Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm, Paul told Timothy. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Now here's what Timothy needs to do. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. We have to keep the hardened enemies of the faith at arm's length. Not ignore them, but keep them at arm's length. What about, speaking of Paul, what about Paul when he was still Saul of Tarsus? Here's a man who said his conscience was always clear, even during the times when he was persecuting the church. In Acts 23, verse 1, he was up before the council. They were looking to throw him in jail. They were actually looking to have him killed. Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." He had a good conscience when he was persecuting the church. And then, once he came to Christ, then he had a good conscience as a Christian. What we learn from this is, unless God is perfectly helping us guide the building of our conscience may not tell us the truth. Finally, Paul comes to Jesus on the Damascus road, but he's not saved yet. He's blind, he's pitiful. They take him to Damascus. He prays night and day till finally they send a preacher. The Lord sends a preacher to him, sends him a teacher, Ananias. But Ananias was terrified to teach Saul because he knew the things that Saul had done. He knew that Saul had come to Damascus holding papers to imprison Jews that had left Judaism for the faith of Jesus Christ. Ananias said, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem." And yet, here's an example of a hardened enemy of the faith who became perhaps the greatest gospel preacher, save Jesus, that has ever existed in this world. Time will generally tell if someone will open their heart to the truth. Let's name some of their characteristics that might reveal who these people are. Notice if someone is aggressive in their rejection of Christ, of God, of spirituality. You know, it took a miracle to change Saul into Paul. His sincerity allowed Jesus to reach out to Saul, convince him of his resurrection and legitimate claims to messiahship, and lead him to be the greatest advocate for Jesus that ever lived. Except for, of course, as we already said, except for Jesus himself. We might know our gospel backwards and forwards. We may be the kind of person that people trust, but we cannot expect to humble people like Saul of Tarsus, or even King Saul of Israel, or Samson, or King Nebuchadnezzar, or King Manasseh. But God did. God can humble these people, and he chose to. Some people will only be humbled by God, not by any efforts that we bring forth. Prospects like these men, then, as we said, should be kept on the back burner, but we can't discard them entirely. Why? Because we cannot infallibly see into anyone else's heart. Only Jesus could do that when he was on this earth. Only Godhood has that ability. We're not Jesus. We're not an inspired prophet. We cannot delve into people's hearts. What can we do then? We can do what Jesus taught his disciples to do, and that's sow the seed of the kingdom. We'll take a moment and turn in our Bibles to Mark chapter 4, and we'll read a few verses here, beginning in verse 3. Listen, Jesus said, behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil, and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. I'd like to thank my brother Lee, who brought this to our attention during our study on the Zoom meeting last week, that we have to be careful not to judge people's hearts, because we can't judge people's hearts. And that's why Jesus, God, does not depend on us for the results of spreading the gospel, but they do depend on us to sow the seed of the kingdom. Let's talk about some indicators that might not be reliable when profiling a good prospect. A good moral person might not be a good prospect for the gospel. You say, well, why? Because think about how much morality plays a part in following in the footsteps of Christ. Jesus, we saw in his day, reached out to the publicans and the prostitutes, to the tax collectors and the loose women of that day. And I apologize for saying loose women. I know that's not appropriate. The publicans and the prostitutes. We'll stick to that. And why? Because these were the ones who had seen sin's darkness firsthand. The good moral person might have the same trouble answering the call of Christ because of the so-called religious churchgoer. One, the good moral person says, I'm good. I'm saved. I'm good. I don't need Jesus. I'm good. I'm a good person. The religious churchgoer says basically the same thing. I'm going to church. That's what I need to be doing. And these folks may be happy just where they are, sitting in the pew on Sunday morning and hardly anything else are they doing for the cause of Christ? Another group that might be less than potential good prospects are those that possess many earthly belongings. Now, in the New Testament, we see exceptions exist, such as two exceptional publicans, two exceptional taxmen, Levi, called Matthew, who Jesus called to be one of the 12 apostles. And then for your own reading, I'll leave you with Luke 19, 1 through 10, where you can see how Zacchaeus, also a tax collector, came to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Well, why am I talking about earthly belongings and tax collectors of the first century Judea? Because these men were rich. They were rich, and their gain was not always honest. You'll get a sense of that if you read Luke 19, 1 through 10. But both of these men became followers of Christ, even though they were rich. The rich, however, are susceptible to sins of covetousness, greed, dishonest gain, etc. The same sins that all of us are susceptible to, but because of their possessions, they have the money to invest in further dishonest gain. In 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 10, Paul warned the young preacher, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation." See, it's not necessarily just the rich, but those that put their mind to it. They fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It's through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Besides good moral people that think they're so good they don't need Christ, besides the religious churchgoer who thinks what he's doing is enough, besides those with many earthly belongings who decide all they need is more earthly belongings, we have the highborn, the wise, and the educated. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in the first letter, chapter 1, verse 26, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth." But of course, there are exceptions to every man-made rule. We know Paul the Apostle was very educated. The man who wrote the Hebrew letter, if it wasn't Paul the Apostle, also very educated. And through the years, Peter developed his own education of the school, from the school of hard knocks, to when we see him writing his letters in the later part of his life. These letters are very well spoken and well written. However, in general, and painting with a broad brush, which I don't usually like to do, we see that those that are highborn, those who are wise in the things of this world, those who are educated secularly, oftentimes feel they have no need for God. Well, how do we distinguish the suspects from the real prospects? We can use salesmanship. One of our classmates in our study the other day said he did not like to call it salesmanship. So I made up a new word, and I know many of you, English is not your first language, and I appreciate you coming to the channel regardless of that. I made up a word, sharesmanship. Sharesmanship. If we are going to share the gospel, if we're going to sell the gospel, we must have confidence in our product. And our product that we are out there trying to share is the gospel of Christ. Well, does gospel work demand good salesmanship? Does it demand good sharesmanship? Are there any principles of good salesmanship that could be applied to spreading the word? Namely, how do we qualify the prospect? In salesmanship, there are two rules. Rule number one, everyone you meet is a potential prospect. But not everyone you meet will feel that they need or can afford what you have to share. So this is how we have to approach sharing the gospel. We have to think that everyone we meet is a potential believer, but we have to be ready to deal with the fact that not everyone we meet will think they need the gospel, or they're not willing to give up the things that it would take to follow Christ. Think of the story of the rich young ruler in the Gospels. Jesus said he needed to give up a lot of things, and he couldn't do it. And it says he couldn't do it because he was very rich. Well, is profiling the prospect helpful at all? I would say it is helpful because it will help you spend your time, your effort, and your energy in a profitable and proper manner as you go about sowing the seed of the kingdom. Our thoughts today are inspired by Dan King's article that we referred to a moment ago, and I want to close out this lesson by reading just another paragraph by Brother King. A person who was not a prospect for the gospel 10 years ago may very well become so at a later point in time. Like the man who could not afford to buy the salesman's expensive car yesterday, but came into a significant inheritance from his parents or grandparents just today. Sometimes people's situations alter greatly over time, and thus their attitudes may change as well. It is important for us to keep our eyes open wide for those signs that our friends and fellow workers may have changed their way of thinking and thus have become prime prospects for the gospel at that particular point in their lives. Things happen to people, and sometimes those things alter the way they think immeasurably. So as Jesus said in Matthew 10, verse 16, we need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, always keeping our eye out and looking for good opportunities to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you for watching. Our photo today comes from Malcolm Lightbody on Unsplash. A man wants to talk about Jesus, and apparently the man he's talking to does not. Come back and be with us soon. We hope to post another video within the next few days. Until then, may God bless.